All right, welcome back, you guys, to Freedom Papers. I'm not alone this time. Connor.
Hey, good to be here. Great to be back.
Oh, and I like your outfit today. You look great.
Thank you, man. You too. I like your shirt.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you tell that I enjoy having Connor on? You guys, we are still on the same topic that we've been on for quite a few episodes now. We're still talking about the failures and insufficiencies of the Articles of Confederation. Last week we did 18, so what do you know? Shocker here, we're doing 19 today. And it's called, once again, The Same Subject Continued. But this is another special one, Connor, because it's Madison and Hamilton combined. I kind of like that about this, when you can tell. But they did a good job of making Publius's voice sound as if you can't tell who's writing it in the first place. I just think it's cool when you know that both of their minds went together on these papers, because a lot of them were written individually. This
like
one...
Dr. Dre and Snoop Dogg coming together, like a collab.
Sure.
We just watched Super Bowl, I guess.
Yeah. I kind of knew what was going on with that. I felt kind of young and hip. Kind of young and hip. I just, honestly, I don't want to go on a rant right now, but I think it's pathetic that we as a society are obsessed with celebrities and athletes and all these people. Like, I think it's fine to love their music, watch their movies, whatever, but why are we obsessed with everything that they do? The pop culture of it's kind of nasty. So
totally agree.
I don't really watch the Super Bowl or anything. I think it's all related to the fall of Rome, but I digress. Everything I send, I should say this, everything I send to you on Instagram, I'm like, does this remind you of the fall of Rome or what?
And sadly, it all does.
Okay. Anyway. But last episode, Connor, you were with me on 18. We talked about some more ancient examples of confederacies not working because Publius is trying to show how they've never really worked throughout history. It's not all working in America right now, so why would we continue this? Last episode was about the ancient examples. Now we're going to talk about, from the founders' point of view, in 1787, what were some of the more present examples they were seeing on the world stage. Specifically, we're going to talk about the Germanic body. So we'll get started with just how Publius introduces this. He says, the examples of ancient confederacies cited in my last paper have not exhausted the source of experimental instruction on this subject. There are existing institutions founded on a similar principle which merit particular consideration. The first which presents itself is the Germanic body. And so I thought that was kind of cool. I didn't know much about the history of Germany. I feel like we don't hear much about it before the 20th century.
They kind of get pigeonholed into one sort of, 4 or 5 year period there, Germany.
Yeah, no, but it's interesting. And so I figured we could just kind of go into this because he breaks down the history of it, the more ancient history of that space, of that land, Charlemagne, and then how they transitioned and tried to fix itself, but why it just can't seem to get its head together. Now, I don't know what kind of lessons you got out of this. I haven't really talked to you about this before we started filming this one today, but I got this message of mediocrity. And I think that's what you guys are going to see too. If you read number 19, whether you already have or you're going to do it after this episode, it's this message of, well, yeah, I mean, it hasn't fully fallen apart, but it's just a terrible situation.
Yeah, it's not doing great.
It's more so of this internal rot that is structured enough so that it doesn't fall apart and collapse completely and get invaded and just completely deteriorate, but it's internal rot that has led to this mediocrity and suffering of the people, and they just can't get out of it because there's structure but not enough structure for positive reform in the government. So I thought that was a really cool lesson because what Publius has said for a lot of this is our Articles of Confederation, or whatever the Anti-Federalists are proposing, is going to lead us to civil war or invasion from foreign powers or all of these terrible, insane situations where we're going to have massive suffering. But this is more of an example of, or it could just be this massive, extended centuries of mediocrity and long-term suffering where nobody is really happy and nobody's really getting anywhere.
Yeah, it's like it could all just kind of suck, right? And I think that's a really good, it's a really good analysis of it, frankly, because that's exactly what we were dealing with. We've heard previews in some of the previous papers about these confederacies about Europe, right? And I think this is the first time that they dive into these in detail. Your book is falling apart, Morgan. God bless you. You should. She just caught like 6 pages under the desk. This is the first time they've actually gone into detail about the kind of actual, confederacies that they've been previewing this entire time, and it's not good. It's not terrible, but it's not good, right?
Yeah.
So it's actually really interesting to dive into because the history of Germany, like we were saying earlier, German history always gets pigeonholed into World War II, right?
Yeah.
But everything that we know about German history in World War II, it's all completely, it makes a lot more sense when you know the context of all of the Germanic states, right? I mean, from Hitler's invasion of Poland to his obsession with Austria and the Anschluss and all these things, all of it makes sense whenever you actually read back into, what they were doing back in these days, in the contemporary days of our founders. So it's a really good, really good paper. Interesting. It's one of the niche ones that they're probably not going to teach you about in school. So that's what we have freedom papers for, right?
Gosh, no. Because I got so many good lessons out of this, and I've been kind of excited for this episode because right before I read 19, I was looking back into my paper, and for those of you who have listened to all the episodes, the Federalist Papers version by Charles Kessler is my favorite one. So it's this one. It's like $7.95 on the internet or at your local bookstore. I have a sticky note here from when I read the introduction by Kessler. And I said the founders built our government to expect bad behavior because of human nature, but provide opportunity for human excellence. And that really sets America apart. What I got exactly from the opposite message of that was in this paper 19, where it had some protections because you allowed for sovereign states. You didn't have this tyrannical ruler, but the tyrannical ruler the leader at the top, he didn't have enough power to have tyranny, but there wasn't any structure, and so you didn't provide for the potential of human excellence. You just kind of had this blah state. So I thought that was perfect timing for me to just have read that intro again. Now, I want to get into the history of Germany and what you said, Connor. You hit the nail on the head. Because World War I, World War II, a lot of it was caused by all of these small states. And if there's one big lesson we've learned from all these papers, it's the fact that small neighboring states are going to constantly have problems. Yeah. One's going to be weaker, one's going to be stronger. You're going to have problems over time. So that's the whole point of having a union of sovereign states in America, to get us working together so that we don't have things like a World War II happening on our soil. Right. That being said, Europe is messy, and our founders knew that back then in 1787. Look what happened with World War I and World War II. It was chaos. You had all these small states that were invaded or fighting each other, and it is exactly what the founders predicted might happen in American soil. So I thought that was kind of full circle to bring it all together in this paper, because they had no idea what would happen in the future in Europe when they wrote this in 1787. Now, Publius goes into talking about Charlemagne. And for those of you guys who don't know, he says basically Charlemagne was this leader at the top. He was the emperor of Rome. Yeah. And I'm going to get all this messed up because there's some big words in here, but he's the emperor of Rome. There were all of these different tribes and different groups of people in what is known as the Germanic body. And as Charlemagne's sons came into power, Connor, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but as time passed on from when he was the emperor, things started to break down a little bit. And you had these new and more powerful sovereign bodies throughout the land that were able to compete with each other. So you had this kind of top power that wasn't as strong as it used to be under Charlemagne. And it led to the states being able to compete with this higher power that was supposed to be leading all of them and bringing them together. And it made this very interesting situation. So Publius says that these individual sovereign states that were technically supposed to be controlled by this higher power gradually threw off the yoke and advanced to sovereign jurisdiction and independence. The force of imperial sovereignty was insufficient to restrain such powerful dependence or to preserve the unity and tranquility of the empire. So there wasn't enough power at the top to get all of these states to continue to coordinate, and so the power of the states actually became more so than this entity at the top that's encouraging them all to cooperate, and it led to some problems.
Yeah, totally did. Well, and the one thing that kind of sets the Germanic folks, the Franks and the Poles and all these different Germanic folks, apart from the other kind of confederacies in Europe, was they had this sense of, and this is one of those inherent things, they've always had this sense of self-assuredness, right, would be the word for it. So whenever you talk about the infallibility of men and how our founders predicted that man was fallen, the Germans had a different view. They felt that they were always, very vastly superior, and they never accounted for the fact that you're going to be dealing with, weak, fallible, broken men. And so they didn't set up guardrails because they didn't feel as though they needed to. And then they got completely run over by themselves, right, throughout this confederacy of states. And that's ultimately what ends up leading to, not to keep bringing it back to this, but it's the natural progression of things. That's ultimately what ends up leading to the world wars is because Germany wants to reclaim their honor on the world stage. They want to reclaim this idea that they are the Übermensch. It's all very Nietzschean, right? And influenced by Friedrich Nietzsche once you get into the world wars. But that's a historically, fundamentally Germanic idea of just superiority, and the idea of the Aryan race was actually co-opted from Persia and the Middle East to become this idea of like racial superiority. I mean, it really goes back to the Germans have big, big heads, right?
Interesting.
At the end of the day, and they think that they're tough guys, but they're actually kind of just drunkenly, disorganized messes. Well, nowadays they're very, very organized because they learned their lesson, right? The Germans, their trains run on time, their clocks are always tight. They're very, very tight, clean, and neat. Didn't always used to be that way, though.
Yeah, I mean, back then, so Publius, after kind of saying what initially happened after Charlemagne's reign starts to wind down, he says the most furious private wars accompanied with every species of calamity were carried on between the different princes and states.
Right.
The imperial authority, unable to maintain the public order, declined by degrees till it was almost extinct in the anarchy, which agitated the long interval between the death of the last emperor and so on and so on.
Yes.
And so just the decline of the higher up power that's supposed to be like that federal government bringing everybody together. If you compare it to what America's Articles of Confederation is, it slowly declined. The states started to rise up in power, and like we've talked about in other papers, some states are more powerful than the others, and what do you know? They end up fighting over ridiculous things.
That's right.
So then he goes and says, out of this feudal system, which has itself many of the important features of a confederacy, has grown the federal system which constitutes the Germanic Empire. Its powers are vested in a diet representing the component members of the confederacy, in the emperor, who is the executive magistrate, with a negative on the decrees of the diet, and in the imperial chamber and Aulic council, 2 judiciary tribunals having supreme jurisdiction in controversies which concern the empire or which happen among its members. Now, this is the big lesson, one of the big lessons from the papers. He goes on to talk about the powers of each of the bodies in government, the powers of the executive, and what all the roles are between the states and that higher form of government. But then he says, for such a parade of constitutional powers in the representatives and head of this confederacy, the natural supposition would be that it must form an exception to the general character which belongs to its kindred systems. So he's saying, now, after I've just listed all these different powers, all of this separation of powers, checks on powers, different roles that the federal government has versus the sovereign states, you'd think that they'd be pretty squared off and not facing the problems that you would generally assume throughout history with a confederacy. But oh no. Right. He says nothing would be further from the reality. The fundamental principle on which it rests, that the empire is a community of sovereigns, that the diet is a representation of sovereigns, and that the laws are addressed to sovereigns, renders the empire a nerveless body, incapable of regulating its own members, insecure against external dangers, and agitated with unceasing fermentations in its own bowels. He then says,
which is beautiful, by that. It's probably the most beautiful sentence ever written about bowels.
I was where are you going with this?
In my opinion.
Yeah, so what do you think about that? Because I totally see that, and again, it's that message of mediocrity.
No, it is. And they built up a system that they thought was perfect in a lot of ways, and then they realized that it really actually wasn't, and they couldn't control through their what they thought was strong, central government, the feudal system that they had in place. They couldn't control their people. They couldn't control really, frankly, anything, but they really thought that they were high on the hog. And then, you fast forward a handful of years, next thing you know, you've got Napoleon in Austria, and then you've got the Catholic Church just coming over and taking all these things. And this is a very, base level historical assessment of the, Germanic Empire. But the reality is that they just became kind of complacent in a system that didn't work, and it ultimately led to their downfall, right? They were not able to do what the founders were doing at the time and say, hey, the Articles of Confederation are not working right now. We have to rethink them. They refused to. They were stubborn, and they didn't do it.
Yeah, well, I thought it was interesting. What was so cool, I love the tidbits, I like the random historical facts. I'm really nerdy in that sense. So he lists out a few of the examples of just how ridiculous this system was, even though they had some rules written down. It looked good on paper, right? Well, in reality, it turns out in one of the conflicts, the emperor himself was put to flight and very near being made prisoner by the Elector of Saxony, so one of the states. Right. So one of the states was so powerful that the leader of it decided to attack the leader of all of the states and try to jail him. That was just one of the problems. Another was that the late King of Prussia was more than once pitted against his imperial sovereign and commonly proved an overmatch for him. And so it's just a common occurrence that the guy who's supposed to be at top leading everybody, imagine like, I saw it as people these days are looking at DeSantis versus Biden and all these situations. It's like DeSantis being able to rise up and militarily match the power of the federal government and say, I'm going to throw Joe Biden in jail. Like that, imagine that happening. You just can't do it here.
No, you can't.
That'd be chaos because there's 50 states.
Exactly.
And if one state goes delinquent and then has the power to match the federal government, oh my gosh.
And we've got big problems
Constant
there, right?
Chaos.
I could see Texas doing that. But that also goes to this point is that like Texas has this we always go back to Texas here, don't we?
Love it.
Texas has this very independent.
Bernie. Shout out to Bernie, Texas.
Amen. Has this very independent, strong-willed, screw you, I'm going to do what I want spirit to it. And that's kind of what we're seeing with I think Saxony, right? Was the one that he referenced specifically, right? And it's the same general idea. And so the founders were actually really genius to say, yeah, we don't really want to do that. Because they could already tell they were having these battles right here between New York and Virginia, right? And the idea of New York overtaking Virginia, just because it had the sheer will to do so and the manpower probably, was terrifying to them. And they knew that it could happen because they looked to Germany and the Germanic states. So it's a tough thing happening over there, but they were smart to get ahead of it.
Yeah, and this all goes back to that anti-federalist versus federalist debate. The anti-federalists, I'm very much on their side on a ton of things. But they were worried about creating a too powerful centralized government. Now I think we have a too powerful centralized government. But at the time, the Federalists were trying to use this as an example for them of what happens when you don't have enough of a national grip on everything to be able to move the country and all of the sovereign states in one direction.
Right.
So just some of the examples of what Germany experienced that the founders cited was that Germany was desolated by a war of 30 years in which the emperor with one half of the empire was on one side and Sweden with the other half of the empire was on the other side. And so half of the German groups were on one side, half were on the other. The leader of the German groups was on one side, going against the other guys, and there were foreign powers involved on both of those sides. So then what happened after this is that peace after the war was at length negotiated and dictated by foreign powers. So then you have two halves of an entity allowing both sides of foreign powers from a war to be a part of the negotiation process of one country. What kind of chaos is that? I mean, what it reminded me of is the Treaty of Paris. Remember after the World War?
Which one? But yeah.
So after the Revolutionary War, good. Look at you. You're so smart. Treaty of Paris was signed after the French and Indian War is what Connor is referencing. And then
Vietnam.
The next one, oh, yes. And then the next one was Revolutionary War. And then there was the one with Vietnam. But the second one for the Revolutionary War that I'm talking about, they really wanted to make sure that America was at the bargaining table as its own country, that it wasn't on the table to negotiate America's sovereignty. It wasn't on the table to say America's now a country. No. America is a country, and they're coming to the table to negotiate peace as their own country with a country that they just fought, England. And it was really important for the founders to do that because England was trying to say that part of the negotiation was allowing America to say we're now independent.
Yeah, they set Yeah, they set a baseline for the negotiations. Basically, they went in with their cards and said, "This is what we got." And we're not budging from here.
Yeah. And so imagine then having to go, if you're in Germany or in the Germanic states, to allow two sides from a war of two different sets of countries not involved in your country at all to be a part of the negotiations that have to do with your internal conflicts. A mess.
It's a bit of foreshadowing, though, by the way, because I think we saw something almost exactly similar to that.
Connor!
A little bit down the road, right? East and West Germany.
And look
Cold
how that
War.
turned out.
Yeah, not very good, right?
What a mess. Man.
Have you ever been to Germany?
I've never been to Europe.
Okay.
And I don't think I'm ever going now because I'm not vaxxed.
No, probably not. I'm going to tell you a really quick aside here because we don't have a lot of time. But if you go to Germany, right, you go to the place where the Berlin Wall was, and it was torn down, thank God. There is such a clear delineation, right, between where the old East Germany was and where the old West Germany was in terms of architecture, in terms of the behavior of the people that live there, in terms of just the general beauty and the upkeep and everything, right? And that's no way to have a country, obviously, right?
No.
And it has lasting impacts because I was in there in 2014 or so, and the Cold War ended, the wall came down in 1991. I could be wrong there, but we'll see. So like it has really lasting impacts, and it's not a sustainable way to build a country at all. Yeah. So they got ahead of that.
Jeez, what a foreshadowing!
Yeah, literally.
Great connection. I can't believe I missed
you were
that.
reading all that, and I was like, wait a second, this tracks exactly.
Yeah, because what it says is peace was at length negotiated and dictated by foreign powers, and the articles of it, to which foreign powers are parties, made a fundamental part of the Germanic constitution. I mean, it was kind of horrible, I think, horrible for all of the world powers to look at half of Germany and say, and everybody behind the Iron Curtain to say, yeah, we're willing to now give full control of you and your futures to the USSR. Have fun, because they went from surviving Nazism to surviving communism, and many didn't survive.
Yeah, well, I mean...
disgusting.
To be fair, Germany did declare war.
I get it.
On the world.
I know the whole... There's
twice.
a lot going on there. Also, friendly reminder, the USSR did not just want to ally with the West. They did not want to be like, hey, America, let's fight a war together. Instead, they wanted to be friends and ally with the Nazis, and Hitler betrayed Stalin.
Right.
And so Stalin was like, what are you doing? Why are you invading me too?
We could have been so
You've
good.
betrayed me,
Right.
and now I have to fight with America. Let's just set the standard there. Okay, so that's a whole other problem. We could do 5 million episodes on that, but this is about America's founding. So let's divert back to that one.
Excuse me.
Another problem that he says that America could face in this situation, going against the concerns of the anti-federalists, is he was saying because of this weakness, if the nation happens on any emergency to be more united by the necessity of self-defense, so maybe they aren't fighting each other, maybe they have to band together and fight a foreign aggressor, its situation is still deplorable for Hillary Clinton. Military preparations must be preceded by so many tedious discussions arising from the jealousies, pride, separate views, and clashing pretensions of sovereign bodies that before the Diet can settle the arrangements, the enemy are in the field, and before the federal troops are ready to even take it, they are retiring into winter quarters. And so before we can even get to the battlefield to fight a war, if we are being attacked, we have to have a million different conversations because there isn't one national mission. You have to get all of the sovereign states to agree to spend resources, put troops, and put all of their energy behind one common cause. But how can you get that common cause agreed upon and invested into by all the states if they aren't really interested in working as a team?
Yeah, it's impossible to have a common cause if you don't have a common identity. Right?
Ooh.
And we're seeing that right now, too. I'm going to keep bringing it back to the present because that's where I feel a lot more comfortable than the Germanic history, right?
What? You're not an expert either on
this?
No,
I know. What the hell? But we're seeing right now that we obviously, as a nation, have a common enemy with China. But it is impossible to convince the United States at large that that's the case, right? And the reason is the exact same. You can't have a common enemy if you don't have a common identity. And the folks on the left who seem to be, and some on the right, who seem to be very much aligned with China in a lot of ways, it's almost like they don't want us to have a common identity. They don't want us to have borders. They don't want us to have a shared language. They don't want us to, love our brothers and sisters and love our land. And so whenever it comes time for us to actually respond to maybe another 9/11 or perhaps a bioterror attack like COVID-19, which we should have responded much more forcefully to, it's completely impossible to do that because we have nothing to rally behind. We used to rally behind the flag. We burn the flag now.
Actually,
half of us
speaking
do.
of which, interesting tidbit from just general anti-federalists versus federalists. One of the arguments by the anti-federalists, again in general, was that a civic education, an educated population, if we kept that up, would never make bad decisions in that sense.
Obviously.
If we remained an educated population, we would be able to avoid instances of tyranny, and we would be able to be separate sovereign states that don't go into the problems of history. And the Federalists were saying, okay, so then what happens if we get one round of a population, one generation that's ignorant? What if civic education fails for one phase of a country? And what do you know? Those people then end up trying to oppress each other because they don't understand history. What do you do in that situation? You have to have a structure of government that protects against anybody that would want to be oppressive. It's too naive to assume that, we'll just remain smart and educated because we're American. We're going to understand how important it is to keep this going. I mean, wow.
Yeah, I mean,
Isn't that crazy?
It's insane. I think it was fair for the founders to assume that everyone would love this beautiful experiment that they were building as much as they did. And that was the case for a long time. And one final note on that, the education system that ended up actually, corrupting and corroding the American project actually came from the German historicist tradition, right? Of Marcuse and Nietzsche and all these different people. So it's almost like we recognize that there were really bad ideas happening over there, and then we put them away for a little while, and then some people with probably really bad intentions came back and said, let's bring those back over, right? And let's figure out how we can divide everybody to make America a weaker nation. So, yeah, the Germans, they're sneaky. You got to watch out for those Germans, frankly.
Way to close that loop.
I'm a loop closer.
Whoop. All right, we'll move on to the next one. Great. I'm a loop closer. Let's get that on a t-shirt.
Quote graphic.
So next up, there was a transition in Germany that Publius then goes on to talk about. An experiment, if you will. He says, the impossibility of maintaining order and dispensing justice among these sovereign subjects produced the experiment of dividing the empire into 9 or 10 circles of districts, of giving them an interior organization, and of charging them with the military execution of the laws against delinquent and contumacious members. This experiment has only served to demonstrate more fully the radical vice of the Constitution, and this was the spiciest sentence of the paper. He says, each circle that was created is the miniature picture of the deformities of this political monster.
Exactly right. It really is beautiful.
So what I got out of that, it's already a problem. The situation of decentralized power, but the states having enough power to challenge the central government is so chaotic, so messy, that when they finally tried to make changes, they didn't make the proper changes. They just made many bad problems of the original core issue. Right. And then you had 9 or 10 mini bad situations. Yeah. And what he calls them, deformities of the political monster.
That's what it was, though. I mean, it was just absolute sheer chaos and disorder. And that's what we were trying to avoid whenever we said, you know what, scrap it. Scrap the entire articles. We're going to go back to the drawing board and redo it from the start. Yeah. It may be painful, it may be arduous, it may be tedious, but it'll be worth it, right? So we don't end up like these guys over here.
Yeah, well, and so that final message, we're going to get to that wrap up for that theme of mediocrity that I got out of it. After going through all the problems, and he goes into a lot more detail, so I encourage you guys to actually read the papers, but there's some big names, there's some big words that I'm just not going to use. He then summarizes it all after going through all the problems, and he says, it may be asked, perhaps, what has so long kept this disjointed machine from falling entirely to pieces? The answer is obvious. The weakness of most of the members who are unwilling to expose themselves to the mercy of foreign powers, the weakness of the principal members compared to the formidable powers all around them, the vast weight and influence of the emperor derives from his separate and hereditary dominions, and the interest he feels in preserving a system with which his family pride is connected, and which constitutes him the first prince in Europe. These causes support a feeble and precarious union, whilst the repellent quality incident to the nature of sovereignty, and which time continually strengthens, prevents any reform whatever founded on a proper consolidation. So, I mean, the problem is that they're in this no-win situation. It's a lose-lose situation where there's enough structure to allow the current form of government, the current situation, to continue without collapsing, but they are never going to get out of it unless they make serious structural change.
Right.
And they are going to continue on a path of constant civil war, constant fighting with enemy forces because they're not strong enough to prevent them, and constant mediocrity in their civilization because of this deterioration of society with all of these problems that they're facing. And there's really no way to get out of it because on top of that, you have these people that think that they are, with this German mindset, put in charge and in such a powerful position, they don't want to give it up. And they reference the leader who is considered the first prince of Europe.
Right.
He's attached to it in an emotional way. So everybody has their own claims to why this system should continue, even if it's a failing system.
Yeah. I mean, those who are granted power that don't deserve it will never let go of that power, right? Because they just feel so, they don't really know why they're there. You know, in this case, it was hereditary, right? They don't get why they're there, but they know that they're there, and they're like, I have no idea what I'm doing here, but I'm not going to let go of it, damn it, because I've got a lot of power over these people. And so they were just basically stuck in their ways, and they said, you're not getting me out of here. I'm on the top of the sandbox here, right? And that led to a lot of issues, obviously. And this is also a great case for why we shouldn't be a monarchy, right? Which I think we'd established that by now, right? But this was a really great case for that as well. So there's so many lessons to be learned from what we saw there. And the other thing that I took away from this, and if you got to wrap something else up, we can. But the one thing that I took away from this, though, is that you can experience whiplash as a civilization or as like a society or culture or whatever, to going from, a weak central authority that looks good on paper but actually is totally ineffectual, to a brutal and strong-armed and imperial dictatorship like that due to overcompensation, right? So it's important to find that sweet middle ground that we did in America, right? But whenever you think about the Germany that we all are familiar with historically, we're talking about a strong central government, right? The one that burned down the Reichstag, and the one that invaded Poland, and the one that laid Austria down without firing a shot, right?
Yeah, well, it's that same lesson that you're taking. He kind of closes up. It's this weird foreshadowing, Connor, because the whole paper is about
It's
the
almost
Germanic
like history
body.
repeats itself. I don't know.
The chaos caused by this system of government that they had set up for hundreds of years. It then talks about the other examples of neighboring areas. And so it says, if more direct examples were wanting, Poland, blah, 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 and it goes on to talk about Poland. It says Poland was equally unfit for self-government and self-defense. It has long been at the mercy of its powerful neighbors.
Poland is one of the best countries on earth, right? And our good friend and contributor at Turning Point, Jack Posobiec, he is a proud Pole, as almost all Poles are. They're very, very proud people. But they are they are the punching bag of the globe. They are just continually dominated by whoever has, the capricious will to go overtake their nation. And that's just a symptom of the culture at large that exists there. For whatever reason, it's always been confounding to me.
Yeah.
I don't know, but Poland's a beautiful country.
Yeah,
Beautiful
and it's a
Catholic
shame
country.
because it talks about Poland, and then it says the connection among the Swiss cantons as well. They have no common treasury, no common troops, even in war, no common coin, no common judiciatory, nor any other common mark of sovereignty. But what's interesting, like you said, with the people of Poland being so proud of everything, there's this concept of pride and heritage in Europe that we just don't have in America anymore. So I'm constantly trying to let people know, like, we have culture in America, we have heritage, we have traditions. Don't let the radical left tell you that we are uncultured people or anything like that. I mean, yeah, I think we have problems and our society is decaying quite a lot. And I would like to see some more traditional behavior, but I think there are things in America that are cultural and traditional that we can pass down by generation. But it says that these countries, part of what keeps them together is just the sense that they feel together. They might not have the best forms of government, but they are kept together by the peculiarity of their topographical position, by their individual weakness and insignificancy. So that's the thing, is like, they aren't trying to be leaders of the world stage in the Swiss cantons, but something about their area and their culture, their people, brings them together. And some of that could be by the fear of powerful neighbors, concept. Right? By fear of powerful neighbors, though. So they talk about Poland, they talk about Swiss cantons, and the other smaller areas around Germany. And they say a lot of these other countries are weak because they're constantly scared of their more powerful neighbors.
Yeah.
Oof.
Well, and this is more of a broad topic here, but it's something I've been thinking about a lot recently. I was talking to Olivia about this the other day, actually. And so America is straying away, and we're so divided and we're so chaotic right now, because we've gotten away from this common identity that we're talking about, right? We are set up in such a beautiful geographic position to be able to share a common identity and have no reason for that to ever be corrupted, by outside forces, right? Unless we allow them in here through legal immigration, which we overdid. But the more that we let these forces come in and corrupt our nation, the more we stray away from fundamental American values like family, right? And property ownership and land ownership and things that actually matter and that are permanent. And then all of a sudden we sit here after degrading the family and deteriorating the idea of private property and, demeaning the notion of a border or a shared language or even a shared currency. And then conservatives are left sitting here wondering, what's going on? Where's my country, right? And that's when we all need to step back and ask ourselves, did we fail at conserving America? And the answer is obviously yes. obviously. And the question, though, is why don't we have leaders who give a damn about our nation enough to say, well, no, America is exceptional. I wish that we had a little bit of that spirit that they have over there in Europe a lot of times, where they will wave their flag left and right, and it's not a bad thing to do.
Yeah.
We used to do that. Not anymore, though. And it really, really, really hurts my heart to think that we have such sinister, evil people at the top of the political food chain here in America who are so willing to just give up on what these geniuses who wrote this paper so thoughtfully crafted.
Yeah, and Publius kind of touches on that, actually, to finish off the paper. And they talk about Poland, they talk about Germany, and they kind of summarize and compare it to what's going on right at the time with the Articles of Confederation. And they say, whatever efficacy the Union may have had in ordinary cases, it appears that the moment a cause of difference sprang up capable of trying its strength, it failed. And so in all those historical situations, whether the last paper or this one, the ancient and the present examples they cited, and with the Articles of Confederation in America, every time this system of government is tested, it kind of fails. And so that's really the lesson that we should be getting out of this. It's been tested so many times before. It's being tested now, and it's not working, so why move forward on it? Is kind of the wrap-up message. But getting back to that message we were talking about earlier and what you were touching on, this idea that our founders were brilliant in the sense of they acknowledged we could have a completely horrific time as a country and have constant warring and all this terrible stuff, or we could be more like the Germanic body and have mediocrity just suck us into centuries of this, not that kind of
middle of the road.
Middle of the road, but not even middle of the road, but like less than mediocre situation. And we want more than that. And so they acknowledge that there's evil out there. They acknowledge the negative aspects of mankind and human nature. And what Charles Kessler had acknowledged in the introduction to this paper, what's acknowledged so many times throughout the writings of this time period, is that we need to acknowledge mankind and write a government that prevents bad behavior, but allows for human excellence. And that is what we allowed. I don't know if you saw this, but I kind of want to end on this one. I watch Fox News, and I love watching Outnumbered. So Harris Faulkner, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, Harris Faulkner, she had a guest on who was more liberal and was talking about how, we should be embarrassed to be America. We have a bad history, all this stuff. And Harris Faulkner, who is black, she was like, my father, or maybe it was her grandfather, men in my family, generations before, when America was not at its best, especially for black Americans, fought for this country. He's a veteran. And he did it because of the concept of what America is, always changing in the sense that our structure of government and society allows for positive change when we know it's time to reform. Now, that doesn't mean crazy constitutional changes like getting rid of the filibuster or packing the court or doing anything dangerous that could disrupt the system, but it means allowing for changes in society to improve seek human excellence and allow for positive change. And I thought that was really special. That's something that the left cannot accept. They act like we are the slave owners of the 1700s when we talk about American history. And I think it's shameful. They're building this message, especially for young students in classrooms, that America is not a country to be proud of. When you don't think that your country is something to be proud of, you're a lot less likely to defend it or want to protect it or want to sacrifice to allow it to continue. And not only that, are you a lot less likely to want to protect it and make it continue, you're a lot more likely to join the side that wants to end it completely.
Yeah.
And that's what we're seeing.
Well, America is an exceptional nation. That's a fact. It's an objective truth. But in order to make people hate America, you have to make America hateable.
Ooh.
It has to become a place that's worth hating. And that's what they've done such a good job at by continuously reminding us of our past and reminding us of the slave trade and reminding us of the Jim Crow and all these things. But they refuse to acknowledge the fact that we have overcome more than any other nation ever in such a condensed period of time. That's the other thing people fail to realize. We're talking about a 250-year-old country. I think less, actually, 248-year-old country, right? And we have gone through hell and high water and a civil war and back again and then to the moon. And we're not going to acknowledge the fact that we fought like hell to make this a beautiful place for everybody?
Yeah.
Well, it makes it seem like it's intentional. It makes it seem like they're just trying to make it seem like a place that is bad and terrible and worth destroying.
It's so intentional. It's not even funny. And
because why else would you leave the borders wide open? And why else would you allow the cities to burn, right?
Well, it's all the decisions made over the last year. I think a lot of Americans are starting to say, this sounds a lot less like incompetence and a lot more like intentional leadership decisions. And I don't mean leadership as in like they're leading us to a great place. I mean, you're in a powerful position of leadership where you should be making good decisions on behalf of the people. And for some reason, you're using your leadership position to make decisions that don't positively impact anybody in this country, but you say that it's for our better.
And your family also has strong ties to China.
Ugh, that's a whole other
Chew on that one for a little bit.
That's a
why
whole
don't you?
other thing. Gosh, that makes me mad. But Connor, that's a really great point. Let's wrap it up, you guys. Thanks for listening to Freedom Papers. We really appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed this history lesson on the Germanic body over the last 1,000 years, I guess, because we're talking about Charlemagne.
Right.
But yeah, final lesson, what you were talking about with this idea of understanding how far we've come, comparative history is a concept completely abandoned in American history classes. And it's just the concept of saying, this is where we are, this is where we used to be, look how far we've come. The ability to compare and contrast and say, wow, a lot's happened. Yep. The other thing is 200 years is not a very long time.
It's actually a very short period of time.
When I read, especially like I have a bunch of homesteader books. My favorite is Montana Women Homesteaders, duh.
Right.
And it talks about just 2 generations before us. The men and women who are our age, I don't know if you knew much about this, Connor, but like single women were allowed to homestead. Yeah. And so if you were single or if you were proven to have been like abandoned by your husband. And so before getting married, a lot of women would have the support of their brothers and their fathers, and they would get a piece of land and homestead on it and then hopefully meet their husband before. And it's just so interesting reading. This was just 2 generations before us. Yeah. People were wagoning out to the
American West,
out to Montana on a wagon, living in a tiny little wood hut that they would have built by hand. And now look at us now in this fancy high-tech studio, just talking about it as if it's ancient. And that's what really breaks my heart, is we can't make those connections from generation to generation. And I think that's one of the biggest downfalls to America, is we didn't pass down the stories and the sacrifices. Generation to generation, we've taken it for granted. I'm going on a rant now about homesteading. So let's wrap it up. You guys, thanks for listening to Freedom Papers, and be sure to tune in. Be sure to subscribe on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. You can find us at Turning Points page. But thanks for listening, and get your copy. Connor, thank you for joining.
Thank you.